The topic that I'll be covering in this presentation is how different personality traits are related to the experience of stress as well as the management of stress. But before I can discuss the connection between personality traits and stress, we need to have clarity about what exactly personality traits are. So this is the question: what exactly are personality traits? To understand personality traits, I think it will be easy if I contrast it with something else, and in this case, moods. Now, here's a graph from a paper that was published in 2000. You see that our moods vary by the time of the day. Uh, so the red line that we see here is referring to how our positive mood varies by the time of the day. And the blue line refers to our negative mood, how that varies by the time of the day. And we do see that our moods do vary by the time of the day. Now, these are, of course, average figures. So there may be individual differences. Nonetheless, in the general population, we do tend to see some changes in our moods by the time of the day. In this graph, which is also from the same study, we see that our moods vary by the day of the week. So we see that we are most unhappy on Sundays and Mondays, the beginning of the week. And then as the week progresses, we tend to feel less negative and the least negative as we come closer to the weekend. We see the opposite pattern in context of the positive moods. We are least positive on Sunday. We are dreading the Mondays, probably because of that. And then our positive moods progressively increases as the week progresses. So what do these graphs tell us? They tell us that our moods vary. They are not fixed. They are not constant. In contrast to moods, if I talk about emotions, emotions can fluctuate much faster. Moods tend to last for few hours or sometimes few days, but emotions can vary much faster. Right now I'm recording this lecture. I'm happy, but imagine I just receive a phone call with some bad news, and suddenly I may become very sad. Right? So emotions can change really quickly. In contrast to emotions and moods, when we are talking about personality, we are talking about something that is very stable. It doesn't change as easily. So people tend to have a consistent way in which they tend to behave, they tend to feel, they tend to think. That consistency give people a distinctive identity. So that makes it easier for us to differentiate between one person from another. One person may be, let's say, prone to be very depressed. Not that the person is always depressed, but much more likely to be depressed, for instance. Whereas another person may be a very jovial kind of person. Not that the person is happy and jovial at all points of time that we meet this person, but generally we tend to see this person happy, jovial person. So this consistency in the pattern of people's emotions, people's behavior, people's thinking processes, that's what we refer to as personality. And it becomes a great way to differentiate between people. So this is personality then becomes an individual difference variable. It gives people some kind of character, some kind of uniqueness. So the way we define personality traits, it's a distinctive and relatively enduring way of thinking, feeling, and acting. Now, where do these individual differences in personality traits come from? A large part of it can be attributed to our genes. Environment does play a role as well, but mostly the early childhood experiences. Um, there's a huge database called the Minnesota Twin Registry, which is a large database of twins, identical twins and fraternal twins and children raised in foster homes. The comparison of these different children who later on grew into adulthood, and their personality traits, has given us some great insights about what percentage of personality variances can be explained by our genes. Because the identical twins, they share the exact same genetic makeup as compared to the fraternal twins, who share only half. And compared to that, if somebody is an adopted sibling, they will not share any genetic makeup at all. So whatever similarities that we may see could be attributed in those cases, let's say, to the environment. So in this graph, you can see that the monozygotic twins, which are the identical twins, they have the same personality. 53% of it is explained by genes, compared to 22% for the fraternal twins, and only 2% for the adopted siblings. Positive emotionality is the tendency to feel positive emotions. Negative emotionality is tendency to feel negative emotions. And constraint is just the opposite of impulsiveness. And so if you are high on constraint, it means you are less impulsive. In any case, we see that there's a large variance explained by genes. Here's another table that explains the same thing which I just mentioned, but here it lists many more personality traits. This is from a study that was published in 1988. It's of course been a while ago, but it's one of the most highly cited research papers in the discipline. And we see, especially this part of the table, it shows what percentage of these personality traits are explained by genes. So 48% of our well-being, in other words, our happiness, can be explained by our genes, and so on and so forth. So the estimates vary, but average will be about 50% of our personality traits can be explained by our genetical makeup. Now coming to the main topic, which is the connection between personality traits and stress. Some of the initial research was actually not done by psychologists. It was actually done by cardiologists. So these two people, Meyer Friedman and Ray Rosenman, in the 1950s, way back in the 1950s, they were cardiologists, so they were receiving patients who had heart problems, cardiac problems, or those who had heart attacks. And they were collecting demographic information about these patients as well. And their analysis of the data, they find that people with certain personality traits had a much higher likelihood of getting heart attacks. So they called that category, broad category of personality traits, as the type A personality. So what is the type A personality? These are highly competitive individuals, highly ambitious, highly achievement oriented. They are very status conscious. They want to reach higher levels of status. They are very time conscious. They don't want to waste time and make the best use of all possible time that they have. They find it difficulty relaxing, and they are often multitasking as well. They're trying to do many things at the same time because, again, they don't want to waste any time. Now, again, I'm trying to explain the typical type A, strong type A personality. That would be, levels of type A personality. But this is what the type A personality was. And in their analysis, they find that such people had a much higher likelihood of getting those heart attacks. In contrast, the type B personality people, these were relaxed, easygoing people. They were social, and the flip side is that they may procrastinate as well. But otherwise, they were cool, easygoing people. They were not as easily stressed, and these people had a much lower chance of getting those heart attacks. So these were some of the initial studies that was done comparing personality traits with experience of stress, and then stress leading to physical problems like that of cardiac arrest. Now let's discuss the connection between the big five personality traits and stress. The big five personality traits, if you have attended my classes before, know are openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The acronym OCEAN, OCEAN, should help you remember these big five personality traits. It's not like some psychologist came up with these personality traits out of his hat. It's not like somebody thought, oh, these are the five most important personality traits. No, it didn't come about that way. Rather, it came out through a very organic process. So there has been personality research has been going on for a long time in the field. But with the advances in statistical methods, specifically factor analysis, all those studies, when they were factor analyzed, to make things very simple, if I give, say, 1,000 adjectives, and I ask you to rate yourself on each of those adjectives, how well does it describe you? Let's say on a scale of 1 to 5 and everything. We will see people who tend to rate high on certain adjectives also tend to rate high on certain other adjectives. So there are certain groups of adjectives that tend to cluster together. And this is how the big 5 personality traits came into being, irrespective of whether the research was done in clinical psychology or educational psychology or social psychology or political psychology. This didn't matter. Always researchers ended up with these 5 different clusters. So, and the exact same patterns. So that is how we ended up with this big 5 personality traits. They are called the big 5, not because somebody thought that these are the most important five most important personality traits, but because these 5 traits explain the maximum amount of variance in the way we think, in the way we feel, in the way we behave. So anything that we discuss in psychology, if we take intelligence out of the picture, because that also explains quite a lot of variance in achievement, for instance. But the big 5 personality traits explain most of the variance in the data. Even the type A personality that we were discussing in the previous slide, even that can be explained in context of the big 5 personality traits. Type A personality essentially is a combination of high neuroticism, high conscientiousness, and low agreeableness. Okay, so this combination is just type A personality. Anyway, we will now go through each of these big 5 personality traits in greater detail and their connection to stress and stress management. I went too far. Okay, now I'm back here. So in 2007, there was one paper that was published by D. Young and even Jordan Peterson was one of the co-authors there. So they, in their analysis, came up with 2 subdimensions per big 5 personality trait. So then we have then overall 10 subdimensions, right? So it becomes more manageable. So if we talk about neuroticism from that perspective, with only 2 subdimensions, the 2 subdimensions come to be withdrawal and volatility. Withdrawal is like withdrawing from anything that you find threatening. Uncertainty can be also threatening to people. So you withdraw. It's like if we talk in terms of fight or flight, it is flight. You are trying to withdraw. You are not facing anything that can potentially cause negative emotions. You try to withdraw from those situations. Volatility is more like tendency to fight, for lack of a better term. But again, hopefully you're getting the analogy here. So it's the tendency to feel angry, irritable, upset. So that is volatility of emotions. So that's neuroticism. Paper that was published. Now let's take a look at another table, again from the same research paper, 2002 paper. Here we see that the trait of neuroticism is negatively correlated with coping ability, negative correlation of 0.32. So the more neurotic you are, the lower your coping ability. So you have less ability to cope with any kind of stress. And there is a positive correlation with perceived stress, which means for the same challenge, you feel like it is a lot of stress. Somebody who is low on neuroticism may not even experience that as a stress, may not even consider that as stressful. But people who are high on neuroticism will experience the same challenging event as more stressful. Something that we have already discussed also when I was describing the the trait of neuroticism, but we also see here in terms of actual data. Now that we have discussed the connection between neuroticism and the experience of stress, now let's see how it is connected with stress management. It turns out that neuroticism also has implications with respect to how we manage our stress. So when it comes to stress management, the common term that is used is coping. So how do we cope with stress? And coping can be broadly classified into two categories: problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping, pretty straightforward. As the name suggests, we try to solve the problem that is causing us to feel stressed. By solving the problem, we eliminate the cause of the problem, eliminate the cause of the stress, and that's how we manage our stress. We help ourselves that way. For example, if a certain assignment is causing me to feel highly stressed, one great way to manage that stress would be to devote some time, work on that assignment, work hard, refer to the necessary textbook, sources, whatever sources, and solve the homework assignment, finish the homework assignment, submit it. And with that, we then eliminate the cause of the stress, and then we aren't feeling stressed anymore. But many a times, problems cannot be solved. We also have problems in our life that cannot at least easily or immediately be solved. For instance, you may be in a horrible marriage. You can't just divorce your partner overnight. There is a long legal process that may take months, years before you can get rid of this abusive spouse, let's say, right? So that's when the concept of emotion-focused coping comes in. So even if you are not being able to solve the problem, we can still manage our stress by trying to manage our emotions. Now, how do we manage our emotions? Again, there are many sub categories there. Problem-focused coping also has many categories. In fact, depending on the number of problems that we have in this world, as many categories probably, right? Math problem will have trying to solve those mathematical problems. Or if it is a time management problem, then the skills associated with time management and so on and so forth. So we can have similarly n number of ways that we solve problems. The same way, there are many ways, if not as many ways as solving problems. We still have quite a number of ways that we adopt when we try to manage our emotions. So that is emotion-focused coping. For instance, I may be highly stressed, okay, because of, again, the same homework assignment that is due and I have not done it, and I feel really bad. One way to make me feel less bad would be to run up to the fridge and take ice cream and eat ice cream. That sweet taste of ice cream, when it reaches my taste buds, there is that dopamine release. I feel good. So this is an example of emotion-focused coping, right? I'm managing my emotions. I'm making myself feel better. I may go and watch a comedy movie, again, making me feel good. It's not solving the problem, whatever problem that I'm trying to avoid, but it still makes me feel good. So that is an example of emotion-focused coping. By the way, not all emotion-focused coping is negative. Emotion-focused coping can be positive as well. You can decide to sit and meditate. And that is, again, emotion-focused coping, because by meditation you are not solving the assignment problem, or you are not solving the marriage problem, right? Those problems are still there, but you have developed the capacity to not let those problems affect you. So emotion-focused coping can also be positive. Anyway, with that broad background, let's see how neuroticism is associated with different types of coping. So the same study that I had described before, 2002 paper, we see that people who are high on neuroticism N here, tend to engage in more defensive coping mechanisms. Defensive coping is a subcategory of emotion-focused coping. So as opposed to going and meditating or exercising, which all will again make us feel good, make us feel better, because of those hormones, positive hormones that get secreted through during those times, as well as the different brain mechanisms. You guys already know that. We would feel better. But defensive coping is the negative side of it. It's like running to the fridge and eating ice cream or drinking alcohol, or another example would be denying that the problem exists. Forget about trying to forget that there is this big assignment that is due. I will may watch Netflix, and all these things are making me feel good in the moment, but the problem is not getting solved. Rather, it can aggravate and create even more problems for me, more stress for me in the future. So what we see is that people who are high on neuroticism tend to again use more emotion-focused coping, as well as within emotion-focused coping, they tend to use much more defensive approaches as opposed to the active approaches, as I said, would be like meditation, exercising. So that is the connection between neuroticism and stress management, or the specific coping strategies that people high on neuroticism tend to use. In contrast, people who are low on neuroticism, they will be using less of those defense mechanisms. They will be using less of those emotion-focused coping mechanisms. So that's what we see here. The next personality trait that we will discuss is conscientiousness. If you again have attended any of my classes, you know how important conscientiousness as a trait is. It is the trait amongst the big 5 personality traits that is most strongly associated with career success. It's also the trait that is associated with even college success and even happiness in marital life and your overall well-being. It's a strong contributor to most good things in life. So all of these big 5 personality traits have both a positive as well as negative side. For instance, extroversion, there are benefits of being highly extroverted. There are negative aspects of being highly extroverted. So that applies to all the big 5 personality dimensions to varying extent, though. And that is the reason I'm saying when it comes to conscientiousness, it is mostly positive. So if you are high on conscientiousness, that is typically under most circumstances, it can be a very valued attribute to have. So what exactly though conscientiousness is? So if we talk in terms of those 2-factor models, it boils down to just 2 factors: industriousness and orderliness. Industriousness is how hardworking you are. So it's about persevering towards attainment of any goal. It's easy for all of us to set goals and get excited about those goals. But do we persist? Do we persevere? That is what matters, right? So when we are talking about industriousness dimension, we are talking about sustaining that effort, persevering, working hard on a consistent basis. That is the dimension of industriousness. And the second dimension, orderliness, as the name suggests, is how organized you are, how systematic you are. People who are high on this dimension tend to, if you go to their houses, you will see everything's well organized, for instance, everything well organized. Somebody who is low on this, it may be very chaotic. Things may be strewn all over the place. Now, again, like any other subdimension, you may be high on industriousness and relatively low on orderliness, and high on orderliness and relatively low on industriousness. So those things are possible, but generally these two variables are positively correlated. So that is the reason they both get clubbed under the trait of conscientiousness. Now, if we look at the 6-facet model, the first one is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy, again, it is different from self-esteem. Self-esteem was more associated with neuroticism. So higher neuroticism, lower the self-esteem. So generally, how do we think about ourselves? That is self-esteem. But self-efficacy is the confidence that we may have with respect to completing a certain task, right? That is self-efficacy. It is specific kind of confidence that we have with respect to completing different kinds of tasks. Conscientious people are likely to feel more of that confidence because of their high industriousness, because of they also being organized. So because of that, they feel that, because they know that they are hardworking, they feel in greater control of themselves. This will also be the dimension that is more associated with internal locus of control. So they have a greater sense of control. They have high self-efficacy. So that's what we are referring to here. Orderliness we have already discussed. Dutifulness. So they feel a sense of obligation, a sense of duty towards the organization that they are working, or towards other people. They feel it is their duty to get things done. Achievement striving, again, and that is in some ways partly related to industriousness, which I mentioned before, persevering towards attainment of goals. And self-discipline. So very self-disciplined individuals. If we talk about exercising regularly, for instance, to maintain a good health, much more likely if you are a conscientious person. I can give you long lectures on the importance of exercising regularly. I can give you long lectures on the importance of meditating regularly. But a conscientious person will have the self-discipline to actually do those things on a regular basis. A person who is low on conscientiousness may try it, may get excited initially and do it, but will not consistently engage in those habits. So that is self-discipline. The last dimension is cautiousness. This is a little conflating with the impulsiveness dimension that we had discussed with neuroticism. So, but essentially what we are referring to here is having the tendency to deliberate, to analyze things before acting on it. So in that way, it's opposite of impulsiveness. So you are a little deliberative, analytical before you analyze things before you take actions. So all positive, desirable qualities. In context of stress, how do you think conscientiousness will impact stress? Now, because these people have high self-efficacy, or as I said, also associated with internal locus of control, they will feel less stress because they feel like they can solve the problem. So they are much more likely to engage in problem-focused coping, right? They will try to solve the problem as opposed to managing their emotions. So we will see a greater tendency of conscientious people to engage in problem-focused coping. They will also engage in emotion-focused coping, but more active form as opposed to passive forms, right? So anyway, let's take a look at some of that data. Now, going back to the table that I had shown you before from that 2002 paper by Penley and Tomaka, earlier I had described the connection between neuroticism and different emotions, and we found that it was most strongly associated with different negative emotions. Now we will focus on the trait conscientiousness. And we see that if you are high on conscientiousness, the likelihood of feeling any negative emotions is actually very low. We don't see people high on conscientiousness experiencing any negative emotions. There is only one emotion, and which is fear, but it is negatively associated. In other words, the more conscientious you are, the less fearful you will be. Fear, probably because you are much more organized, you manage your things well, so you have less reason to fear. So you feel better prepared. Consequently, you feel less reason to be fearful of anything. So that could be one of the reasons why conscientious people are more likely to not feel that sense of fear. But another really interesting thing that we see in this table is that people high on conscientiousness experience a lot of positive emotions. Okay, even though extroversion, again, I haven't come to the personality dimension of extroversion yet, but extroversion typically is the personality trait that is described as the tendency to experience positive emotions. And yes, we do see in case of extroversion here, they do experience some positive emotions, but we are seeing that greater number of positive emotions being experienced by people who are conscientious. And this is really interesting because, as I said, if you are highly conscientious, you are likely to be much more happy in your life, especially when we're talking about long-term overall well-being. We are much more likely to be happy. Why? Because you get things done. And when you get things done, you feel good about yourself, right? Uh, when you don't get things done, you feel a sense of guilt. You feel unhappy. That keeps actually, even if you try to avoid not thinking about it, it still keeps bothering you. So conscientiousness that's the reason I was saying. Generally, it turns out to be a great trait to have, to be high on, because it overall makes us very happy and successful in our lives. So we see here that people high on conscientiousness tend to feel a lot of pride, hope again, you can imagine, because they are working hard, they are much more optimistic, much more hopeful about getting things done, happiness, but even compassion. So overall positive emotions much more likely to be experienced by people who are conscientious. Now, when it comes to managing stress, conscientiousness also turns out to be a great trait to have. Uh, Again, back to the Penley and Tomaka paper, this time in context of how different personality types appraise stressful situations, we see that people high on conscientiousness tend to not experience the demands as stressful. Okay, it is negatively correlated. They feel they have much higher coping ability to deal with the challenges, to deal with those demands that they have in front of them. And the appraisal ratio, I haven't explained what exactly appraisal ratio is, but you would remember this chart that I have discussed so many times before. So we have demands or problems, which was demand here on the x-axis, and we have the capacity to deal with, or the coping ability to deal with those challenges. And we have discussed that if the demands are higher than our ability to deal with those demands, then we feel stressed. And if our ability is higher, our coping ability is higher than the demands we have, then we don't feel stressed. When there is a good match, we get into the state of flow. So appraisal ratio that's exactly what appraisal ratio is. It is demand over perceived coping ability. So that's the ratio. So if you have high appraisal ratio, that means you are appraising the situation to be a threat. In other words, you will be much more stressed. If you have a low appraisal ratio, you are appraising the situation not as a threat. You are seeing it as a challenge, something that you can overcome, and something that then gives you confidence, that gets you excited to deal with that challenge, to deal with that problem. And what do we see? We see that the appraisal ratio is negatively correlated with conscientiousness. In other words, the higher the appraisal ratio, the more threat appraisal is seen people who are low on conscientiousness. Or in other words, people who are high on conscientiousness are much more likely to make the challenge appraisal. So they have a much more likelihood of seeing the problems as a challenge that can be overcome, as opposed to seeing it as a threat and getting too stressed about it. So a really important thing to keep in mind. And we see they positively correlated with self-responsibility, self-control. As I've already mentioned, internal locus of control more strongly associated with conscientiousness. And overall stress, perceived stress is low. So if you are high on conscientiousness, the same stressful situation, while somebody low on conscientiousness will feel highly stressed, you will not feel stressed if you are high on conscientiousness. Lastly, with respect to coping strategies, I have already mentioned this, I think, when I was discussing the trait of conscientiousness earlier, but we see that they engage in more active forms of coping, right? And I've mentioned this. They are much more likely to, let's say, take up the habit of meditation, take up the habit of exercising regularly, take up the habit of doing pranayam or the different breathing exercises, or take up the task of solving the problems. So much more active form of coping as opposed to avoidance or defensive forms of coping. So that's what we see with people who are high on conscientiousness. The next personality trait that we'll go through is extroversion, which is the opposite end of introversion, right? This is a dimension that I typically go through in much more extensive detail in the leadership classes that I teach. In here, I won't go through in as much detail because it is not as strongly related with stress. It does have certain connections, but not as strongly related with stress as, for example, neuroticism and conscientiousness is. In any case, extroversion, if we discuss it in form of the two factor model, two subdimensions model, enthusiasm, joy, engagement. So extroversion is typically described as the big five personality dimension that is associated with positive emotions. It's the tendency to experience positive emotions. So joy, enthusiasm, engagement, being fully engaged, those are all that is described under extroversion. But another thing that is described under extroversion is assertiveness. Assertiveness in terms of social dominance, in terms of expressing things verbally. That is also described under extroversion. If we discuss the six-facet model, friendliness. Friendliness refers to making friends easily and having a lot of warmth in you when you are interacting with individuals. That's what then makes you a very pleasant person to interact with. Gregariousness is more to do with engaging in group situations. So, for instance, like engaging with people at a party. So, friendliness is more one-to-one, though it need not be one-to-one, but having the tendency to be very friendly, nice. Nice may not be the best term, but having a lot of warmth in you, being making friends easily. Gregariousness is being very comfortable in group situations, party situations. Assertiveness, I've already mentioned about. Activity level refers to energy. So people high on extroversion tend to be much more energetic because again they have a higher amount of positive emotions, tendency to experience positive emotions. So more enthusiasm, more energy. They tend to seek a lot of excitement too. So they seek a lot of excitement. Again, I won't go into the biological mechanism, the neurological mechanism behind these, which I do in context of leadership. But again, they seek excitement. Cheerfulness, again, positive emotions. They tend to be much more cheerful, positive, joyful individuals. So now, how would this relate to experience of stress and managing stress? So when it comes to appraising stressful situations, we do see that people high on extroversion tend to perceive situations not stressful, right? So it is negatively associated with perceived stress. And extroversion, because of those positive emotions, give people more ability to deal with stresses. So coping ability is higher. They also may be experiencing more control, more responsibility. So we see some positive effects of extroversion on appraisals of stress. And when it comes to the experience of emotions, we do see that it is associated with more positive emotions, specifically happiness and even pride to a certain extent. Maybe they take pride in the fact that they have so many friends, and so the pride here could be different from the pride that a conscientious person will experience. A conscientious person will experience pride with respect to getting things done, being organized. An extroverted person may experience pride more with respect to having so many friends, having that kind of positive evaluation of self that way. But in any case, we do see those positive effects on emotions and negative effects on some of those negative emotions. So they are less likely to feel fearful, maybe because they have so many friends, and self-disgust, less likely to feel disgust as well. So some good things here. Now, when it comes to coping mechanisms, we don't see extroversion having any major impact on the specific type of coping mechanisms that Penley and Tomaka examined in their study. Even though people extroverted tend to be more satisfied with themselves. Now, this does not mean that extroversion does not impact coping mechanism at all, right? For instance, an extroverted individual may deal with stress very differently from an introverted individual. An extroverted individual may go and party and or spend time with friends. So that could be the emotion-focused coping that an extroverted individual engages in. Whereas an introverted person will not engage in that kind of coping mechanism. That person may prefer to, sit alone, maybe read a book, or more solitary kind of mechanisms is something that an introverted person may employ when he or she is trying to deal with stress. So we will see some differences, but we don't see that showing up in Penley-Tomaka's study specifically. Because again, Penley and Tomaka don't go into those specific strategies of stress management. Now, extroverted individuals can also feel more stress in certain situations, right? Especially right now with the stay-at-home orders. An extroverted individual is likely to feel more stressed. You can understand why. Because such a person loves interacting with people, likes parties, and so an introverted person will not feel as stressed being stuck at home, whereas an extroverted individual will feel more stressed, right? So certain situations can make certain personality traits more prone to experiencing stress, whereas certain other situations may make other personality traits feel more stressed. An introverted person could feel more stressed at a party, for instance, whereas an extroverted individual feeling stressed because he doesn't have the opportunity to go out and party like it's happening right now. The fourth personality dimension will be openness, and if we discuss it in context of the two-factor or the two-facet model, we see openness, which is tendency to be engaging in creative pursuits, having that artistic kind of sensibility. And the next one is intellect, which is the tendency to engage in abstract thinking or wanting to engage in abstract kind of thinking, concepts, ideas, theories, more abstract as opposed to concrete issues. If we discuss that in the 6-facet model, first one is imagination. Again, we are talking not about imagination ability, but the tendency to engage in imagination. So Einstein had superb imagination ability, but not everyone who is high on this facet has the imagination ability of Einstein or Steven Spielberg, right? So, but people who are high on this imagination fantasy dimension tend to like or tend to have a tendency to engaging in more of imagination activities. They tend to have artistic interest. By feelings, we mean they tend to be more expressive with respect to their feelings. That's a stereotype about artists too, right? They tend to be very emotional, emotional not in the neurotic sense, but in terms of being expressive with respect to their feelings, whatever it is that Adventurousness would be also like loving traveling and exploring new ideas, new thoughts, new places. Intellect, especially, is same as I've discussed before, being interested in abstract thoughts, abstract ideas. This is the portion, this facet, intellect is the subdimension that is not strongly, but fairly positive, correlated with intelligence, IQ. Um, and liberalism. Liberalism, not the political dimension of liberalism, but it's about being unconventional. That's what is being referred to here. Not conforming to traditions. That is what we are referring here. And though there is this dimension does correlate with the political aspect of liberalism too. So people who are liberals, they generally tend to score higher on the liberalism dimension. Conservatives tend to score a little lower on this liberalism subdimension too. So even though they're correlated, they're not exactly the same thing. When we are talking about liberalism here, we are not talking about the political belief of liberalism, but having the tendency to engage in unconventional thinking. Now, when it comes to openness connection with stress appraisal, we see it is negatively correlated with demand. So you are less likely to see the demands, the problems as being too much demanding. And people high on openness also tend to believe that they have greater coping ability to deal with those demands. Probably because of they being more imaginative, they think that they can come up with creative solutions to the problems, so they may engage in more problem-focused coping too, right? We do see some positive correlations with they having more internal locus of control, and they do take self-responsibility more. But the interesting thing is that they also perceive the stress, overall stress, to be less. So the more open you are, the less likely is it that you will view the situation as stressful. Now, when it comes to the effect of openness on positive emotions, overall we see no significant effect, even though it is generally positive, but not in a statistically significant way. Similarly, it is negatively associated with negative emotions, but not statistically significant, meaning it can be just a chance occurrence, right? So we don't have much to discuss here, though, openness can be associated with certain positive emotions. Like, for instance, when if you have a creative tendency and engage in a lot of those artistic, creative activities, it can give you a lot of sense of fulfillment, right? But we don't see that statistically significant here, because just having that artistic tendency is not enough. One needs to have ability in those areas as well, right? Only then we will have that sense of accomplishment in those artistic or creative disciplines. So that is what I am referring to here. Now, when it comes to the connection between openness and coping, we see that it is positively associated with active coping. Which is great, because active coping is good opposed to passive or defensive coping. Active coping also can be both positive, can be both problem-focused coping as well as emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused because, again, if you are high on openness, you will seek out creative solutions to the problem. So that's the reason we may see positive correlations between openness and active problem-focused coping. But there are also reasons why we may see positive correlations between openness and active emotion-focused coping, like meditation, trying out meditation, and anything else, the breathing exercises. Why? Because if you are more open, you will be more open to trying out something new, something that is different from your traditional belief systems. So that is the reason openness could also be associated with the active form of emotion-focused coping. But people high on openness do not engage in defensive coping mechanisms. It's negatively correlated, although not statistically significant. One really interesting thing is that openness is also the trait that is negatively associated with passive endurance. Passive endurance is almost like learned helplessness. You decide to just endure the problem until it passes away. You just decide to live through it until it passes away. In certain situations, it may be fair to employ this strategy, but the passive part is problematic. Endurance is fine, but the passive part is problematic, right? Because you are not trying things to fix the situation, to make things better. You are just passively deciding to live through the problem that you have. So thankfully, openness is the trait that is negatively, and in fact, the only trait here that is statistically significant when it comes to its relationship with passive endurance. And we can understand why, because people high on openness will seek out creative solutions to the problem at hand. So they will not like to passively endure the difficulties, the problems that they are facing. Now, beyond Penley and Tomaka's results here, we can also think of situations where openness can be a detriment, right? I can say that from my example, personal example. In one of my previous jobs, that was highly paying as well as highly prestigious, I was actually not happy. I was stressed. And that is despite the fact that I had high openness. I'm very high on openness dimension. In fact, because, not despite, but because of my high openness, I was more stressed there. The reason being, the job was such that it was very systematic. Everything had to be very clear cut, precise, structured, whereas me being high on openness, I sought the opportunity to engage in creative pursuits, which, for example, I get now when I'm working on research papers, even when I'm teaching, trying to use creative methods of teaching. So that gives me a lot of satisfaction. But you may be in a job that does not give you any of those avenues of engaging in creative pursuits, engaging in intellectual activities, right? If you are high on openness and you are in such a job, you will then be more stressed. Okay, so as I have mentioned before, all the big 5 personality traits, they have it's not automatic that they are always positive or all negative. They have certain positive aspects, some negative aspects, and depending on the situation, it could work in your favor, work against you. But generally, now we see the patterns that I have described in all these studies so far. Generally, the openness turns out to be a good or an asset to have, because it generally helps us manage our stress better. So sorry about that distraction. I got that phone call. In any case, going back to the facets of agreeableness, the last facet was sympathy. So this essentially refers to people's tendency towards understanding other people's emotions, being empathetic towards other people's emotions. So that's what is being referred to here, being compassionate. And we see that also as one of the main subdimensions in the two-facet model, compassionate, which is what I just mentioned. And the second subdimension is politeness, which again probably will be more strongly associated with cooperation and modesty. So you're trying to live according to the interpersonal norms, as opposed to being disagreeable and being very competitive. So that's essentially what agreeableness is. Now we will see how agreeableness is connected with stress experience and stress management. When it comes to appraising the stressful events, we see none of the correlations for for agreeableness was statistically significant. So we do see some correlations to be positive or negative, but they were not high enough in magnitude to be statistically significant. So nothing interesting here. When it comes to experience of emotions, not significant with any of the negative emotions, not significant overall with positive emotions either, though positively associated with happiness. Maybe when you engage in some altruistic activity, some helpful activity, you feel satisfied, but with none of the other positive emotions. Strangely, at least in Penley and Tomaka's study, they didn't find correlation with compassion either. That's a little strange because, as I mentioned, people high on agreeableness tend to have more of a compassionate orientation. But this could be a statistical artifact here. But this is what Penley and Tomaka found. When it comes to coping strategies, we see that agreeableness is positively correlated with social support seeking. So that would be an emotion-focused way of coping. Specifically, what it means is when you are stressed, you like to share your problems, discuss your problems with another person. We, for example, see that also more among women, the social support seeking. And that's partly explained because of women being higher on agreeableness in general compared to men. So any individual man could be higher on agreeableness than another individual woman. But overall, if we look at the distribution of agreeableness in men and women, women on average tend to be higher than men, about half a standard deviation higher specifically. But so that's the unique thing that we see here. And people high on agreeableness tend to also engage in passive endurance. I have already discussed passive endurance. So this can be problematic. So because agreeable people do not like conflict. They like to cooperate with others. They don't want to displease others. They may decide to just passively endure the problem that they are facing, as opposed to displease others and talk about the problem openly in front of them, for instance. So this could be especially problematic in relationship context, where they passively endure the problem as opposed to leaving a abusive relationship, for example, or breaking off such a relationship. So agreeableness in that context can be problematic. Here are a couple of slides about coping. I have already mentioned this. I should have just had these slides before. So I won't explain this again, but at least you have these slides so that you know what coping is, what problem-focused coping is, what emotion-focused coping is. You have the actual definitions. Then here are some other forms of coping that I have also mentioned in my presentation so far. But here you have all those definitions. Another important thing to keep in mind when we are discussing the connection between personality traits and stress is situation. Whenever there is a good match between the personality traits and the situational variables, we do not feel stressed. But when there is a mismatch, we feel more stressed. Let me give an example. An extroverted individual, a highly extroverted individual, if you put him in solitary confinement, he's going to be extremely stressed. Now, this is despite the fact that I mentioned previously before that extroversion does have certain strengths when it comes to dealing with stress. But in this particular situation, it's going to be a problem. But if you put an introverted person in solitary confinement, he may not like it, but he's not going to be as stressed as the extroverted individual, right? So the match between situation and the personality trait is very important. As I have mentioned again before, all personality traits have certain positive aspect of it and certain negative aspect of it. So each of those personality traits then give us advantages in certain situations and could be a disadvantage in another situation. So that is the key thing to remember. Another example that I have already mentioned in context of how my high openness led me to feel more frustrated, more stressed in one of my previous jobs, because there was a mismatch there. My high openness was not getting an opportunity to be exercised there. So I was not very happy. Whereas I am happier in a job where I get opportunity to engage in intellectual discussions, to engage in creative pursuits. So that match is very important. If I explain it in form of the diagram that I always refer back to again and again, is that our personality traits are directly related with our capacity, and they influence our capacity in varied ways. The demands and problems could be discussed in form of coming from the situation. Demands in certain situations could be coming from within us, but mostly we talk about demands coming from outside us. The environment, the situation, the boss, the wife, the husband, uh, the professor, they are putting demands on us, right? So now wherever there is a match, going back to the extroverted person's example, an extroverted individual is having higher capacity to deal with people, lot of social interactions, but that will work against him in a situation where what is required is working in a solitary kind of situation, right? So, so in that case, high extroversion is actually related to lower capacity. And that is the reason this person is going to feel more stressed. Okay, so whereas the introverted person will have an advantage in a situation where the demand is that of being in a solitary situation. So that's the thing to keep in mind. Openness, as I said, can be an asset, but it can be a liability in a situation where low openness is required. Agreeableness similarly can be an asset in certain situations, can be problematic in other situations. Same with respect to the other end, disagreeableness. Okay, so this is another very important thing to keep in mind. And related to the connection between personality traits and situation is the aspect of how personality traits manifest in context of relationships. So especially when we are talking about any kind of intimate relationships, is there a good match between our personality traits, or is there a mismatch that then could lead us to feel more stressed or less stressed? Let's take, for example, that you are married to a person who is very conscientious. That should be good. But what if you are very low on conscientiousness? That can be very frustrating for both the partners. The highly conscientious person would want, especially if he or she is highly high on the orderliness subdimension, she may want everything organized. Whereas you are low on conscientiousness, you will come and throw your socks or towel in a disorganized way. That can frustrate the other person a lot. That can cause a lot of stress in the other person, and then that person expresses all that stress, dissatisfaction, unhappiness towards you, which then can make you more stressed. So that matching is again very important. We can take about any other dimension as well. Let's say extroversion, introversion. Let's say one of the partners is highly extroverted, whereas another partner is highly introverted. So one person may be wanting to party, wanting to go to social gatherings, whereas the other person may prefer, just spending a quiet evening. Now, initial few times, it may not cause as much stress, but over a period of time, that can be a bone of contention between the two partners. So this is something that, again, we need to keep in mind. I'm not going into too much of detail here. We can go through all those possible combinations that will make this already long video much longer. But this personality traits do play a big role in context of relationships. Now, again, I'm not saying that you should not marry someone, or you should not pair with someone who has a opposite personality profile. No, exactly. Marrying somebody who has the exact same personality profile as you can be problematic too, because it can then become very boring. Uh, you want some amount of difference, but not a huge difference. So that can be a good rule of thumb when it comes to personality traits and satisfaction in relationships. The last point that I want to discuss in this presentation is about the stability of personality traits. In fact, that's how I started my presentation. In contrast to our emotions and moods, for instance, personality traits tend to be much more stable. They don't change as easily. That's the reason it becomes a great individual difference variable, right? So what does this mean in context of stress management then? It means that we cannot change our personality traits very easily. If we cannot change our personality traits very easily, then one thing that we should try doing is we should try to seek working in situations where there is a good match between our personality traits and the demands that come from the situation. If we do that, we will not be as stressed because we will be having higher capacity to deal with the challenges that come from those situations, right? So that is one thing to keep in mind. Uh, how all these studies, everything that I discussed about big five personality traits and the connection with stress, how you can use that information to be less stressed in your own personal life. But what about we trying to change our personality traits? So, of course, the traditional view was that you cannot change your personality trait. And once you are past your adolescence, you cannot change your personality trait. That was the traditional view. But now we do know that personality traits change, but not in a major way. So let me share the next slide now. Now, here are the results from Roberts' meta-analytic study, the 2006 paper that was referenced in the previous page. We see that all the big five personality traits can change, and they do change. There is evidence of it in the literature. The change is relatively marginal. So if you were a strongly introverted person, you will not become a strongly extroverted person, or vice versa. And same applies for any of these personality traits, but they can change. So that's good news, especially if you are in a situation where there is a mismatch between your personality trait and the situational variable. In fact, seeking out change is a good thing. That is how we develop our character. That is part of our character development, right? The best way to think about it is, so on a scale of 1 to 100, let's say you are at 30, okay? 100 highly extroverted, 0 highly introverted, you are at 30. So relatively high introverted person. Let's say conceptually, you usually function between that range, between around 30. That's how you, that's where you mostly function. When we are talking about trying to change our personality, it's difficult to actually change that trait, at least not very quickly, but we can definitely change our behavior, right? I may be an introverted person, but I can make a conscious effort of going and spending some time at a party, even though that is not something that I will probably enjoy. But if I know that that's something that's going to be beneficial for my growth, for my development, for me being more successful in my career, I can make a conscious choice of going and spending time interacting with people. I may not be able to do that for extended periods of time because that will be too much of a stress, but periodically, over a period of time, I can gradually increase the time that I spend so interacting with people. And the more time I spend interacting with people, I will also learn certain skills associated with interacting with people that will then increase my capacity to interact with people, right? So even though my personality trait, even if we assume that it doesn't change, even if it still remains at 30, now I have greater variance. I can function at 30, I can function at 25, but I have increased through my skills. I can function also like a person who is, let's say, having a trait of 40 on the extroversion dimension or 50 on the extroversion dimension. So we need to think about the skills as well. So we can at least develop the skills. And well, there is other research as well on how there are different strategies with respect to increasing our capacity with respect to those different dimensions, but that then will become even more long video. But overall, these are the things to keep in mind to consciously try to push ourselves in the direction that we ultimately aspire to be. And that's how we will be better at managing our stress.